So I've been amazed, well, I'm continually amazed by how our ancient texts can speak afresh to me. That it is amazing, like our texts are centuries, millennia old, and yet somehow they still seem relevant to what's happening in my life today. Not every part, not every day, but so often. So tonight begins Purim. And we take for granted when we read the book of Esther that we already know the end of the story. Right? We already know that the story of the Jewish people under attack will be victorious. That the bad person, Haman, excellent. Right. Okay, that's enough. If his name comes up again, let's just assume that we've booed, okay? That every time he who shall not be named is mentioned, right, we already know because we're dressed up in costumes and we see little cute Esthers running around and we already know the end of the story. But this year I am taking a different take on it, and so I'm bringing some of the text of the book of Esther that we'll read tonight and tomorrow. I want us to slow down and to see what is underneath the text. Because to me, it spoke of the moment that we are in, not with the frivolity of a carnival, but at a time of war, at a time of anti-Semitism, at a time of fragility. Because whereas we know what happens in chapter 10 of the book of Esther, I want to suggest as we go through this that we are in the midst of the book. And we don't know what the next chapter in our life will be at this time of fragility and of hate. So I think that there is some wisdom to be found from a book that's both very familiar to us, but also maybe we can slow down and get some new insights into it. So I'm zooming ahead to chapter 3. We know Vashti, we know that whole story, that's chapter 1, and then chapter 2. I'm focusing us, I think the core of the book is actually chapters 3 and 4. Okay, so we're going to look at chapter 3. And just so people at home can hear what's happening, normally I would have someone from the congregation read. I'm just going to read because of the microphone and the streaming. So we're at the top of the first page, Esther chapter 3, verses 3 to 6. So then the king's courtiers who were in the palace gates said to Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's orders?" Right? What gets this whole story going here? Why are you disobeying the king's orders? When they spoke to him day after day and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's resolve would prevail, for he had explained to them that he was a Jew. So Mordecai says, I'm Jewish and I don't bow down. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel or bow low to him, Haman was filled with rage. But his disdain to lay hands on Mordecai alone, having been told who Mordecai's people were, Haman plotted to do away with all of the Jews, Mordecai's people, throughout the kingdom of Ahasuerus. Right, so here we have that this is not a conflict between Haman and Mordecai. Haman is taking this that you, Jew, Mordecai, and all of your people are disrespecting me. And so I'm going to do away with all of your people. Right there, today we would definitely call that anti-Semitism. Right? But it's also stereotyping, right? That because of one person, I am going to characterize all of your people that are similar in this negative light. That's what motivates, that's what's underneath this story here. So Esther Rabbah, which is a midrashic text, says, Mordecai prayed to God and he said, "It is revealed and known before your throne of honor, master of the universe, that this is not due to haughtiness or arrogance." Mordecai is telling God, I'm not bowing down to Haman because I think I'm better than him, that I don't prostrate myself to Haman. Rather, it is due to my fear of you, God, that I am being respectful to you, that I act in this way, and I did not prostrate myself to him. It is because I feared you, God, and did not wish to grant the honor due to God to him instead. Because I'm very clear that Haman is a person. He may be a government official, but he is not God, and so I am not going to do this. This is Mordecai's voice. I should point out that while Mordecai is actively talking to God in this midrash, God does not appear in the book of Esther at all. Right? Interestingly, the rabbis sort of find a loophole, backdoor way to say that maybe God is in there, but God is not named at all in the book of Esther. It is a full story, and I think this is important. It is a story of humans and humans, of how we treat each other, which I think amplifies it for me to understand this moment of how we treat each other. Adine Steinsaltz adds that despite Haman's many duties as senior minister, he was busy. He had a lot going on, right, of this massive empire. He developed an obsession with the Jews because they were Mordecai's nation, and he sought a way to eliminate them. I feel this way. I feel like people are focused on the Jews, are focused on us, are focused on Israel to a way that makes no sense. It feels like an obsession. Right? I heard a report, 25 million Sudanese are displaced in an active civil war that has caused hundreds of thousands of deaths and starvation. Barely a news story. In this interview that I heard on the BBC, they actually said that people focused on Sudan were upset because sort of Ukraine and Gaza is sucking the oxygen out of all the conversation. To hear is something that is at a much larger scale. So it does feel like an obsession. All of this is a frame for what is happening in war in Gaza is bad. That is why we pray for peace. But it does feel like there's an unusual obsession with what is happening with the Jewish people. But I want us to move forward. So here in chapter 3, we also see what is Haman's plan here at the bottom of the page. It is to destroy, massacre, and exterminate all the Jews, young and old, children and women, on a single day, and then to plunder all of their possessions, is what the text tells us. It feels like a Hamas handbook. Right? That on this day, this is what we are going to do. Right? And this is amazing. This is a book from long, long ago. So here in chapter 4, this is my favorite line of the whole book of Esther. This is where Mordecai tells Esther that maybe you have come into this position of power of being queen in order to save your people. Right? And I think that as the Jewish people, we have thought about this quietly. We may not have been familiar with this verse, but we've acted as if we did. When Mordecai was told what Esther had said, Mordecai had this message delivered to Esther: do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. On the contrary, if you keep quiet, keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, perhaps you have attained to royal position for just such a crisis. I think about this line because we as the Jewish people have found our moments of influence, maybe for each of the crises that we face as modern Americans. There's a way that we can use our influence for good. Right? That's what Mordecai is telling Esther here. Use your position of influence, go to the king and save your people, use your influence for the moment of good. And that resonates also with me, that maybe this is the moment that our influence has to be used for good. And that's not a singularity. Good means many different things in many different ways. This is not just good exclusively for the Jewish people. Not that there's a single act that would be defined as good, but for the good of the region, for the good of peace, for the good of Israel, for the good of Israel, which is peace with Palestinians and the Arab nations. Right? For the good that we have to do to stop so much horror that is happening. So let's slow down here. Esther asks everyone to fast before she goes to the king, because it's a certain death sentence to go to the king. If you go in without an invitation, it says repeatedly in the text that it's the end of you. And yet she has to do this, realizing Mordecai's charge, but also this sense of agency that she has, really for the first time, I think, in the story. And so she asks everyone to fast for 3 days. It literally is just a sentence or two, and then it skips over. But I want to focus on that. What do we think Esther, and what do we think the kingdom of all the Jews in the kingdom who are fasting and praying and hoping for 3 entire days, they know about this plot against them, and if she's unsuccessful, Haman will carry out his plan. So what do we think the Jews of Shushan were feeling in those days? Imagine, put yourself in their position. What do you think that they were feeling? They were joyful?
Frightened and scared.
Frightened and scared, Mitchell says. Yeah. Right, can you imagine? Yeah.
Time stands still.
Those were probably the 3 longest days they ever had experienced. The time stands still. Being in such fright and fear and insecurity that those days must have been the longest ever. Absolutely. Right? And they were probably frozen in that time, not knowing what to do, of looking at each other and feeling like, is this the end of us? Where do I belong in this kingdom that we are full citizens of, if you will? They didn't have citizens back then, but we are full parts of this kingdom, and yet we clearly are not. Right? Slowing down, I've heard so many conversations of people saying, people hate us here in America, and people hate us in Israel. Where do I belong? Where is my place? I've heard so many conversations about no one asking at work how I'm doing. Right? And even though when George Floyd happened, we were allies with African Americans and marching and at rallies and holding signs, that now it seems like the rallies and the marches are for the people that hate us, not that are lifting us up. So this space of those 3 days in the story of Esther, I get it. I have felt it more than I have ever had before. And that while it's only a verse or two of the entire 10 chapters, it's actually the piece that I feel that is where I am sitting right now. Because I don't know how my next chapter is going to be. Right? Remember, when we read Esther, it's easy to just blow through uncomfortable parts because we know how it ends. I don't know how our story today ends. Mitchell?
We were talking about this last night at Shabbat dinner. I'm sitting here, what are my neighbors doing right next door to me? What are they thinking? What are they going to do on this day? Are they going to come after me or not defend me?
Yeah. So what are our people around us doing? What is our broader community? Literally our neighbors and figuratively our neighbors at the church across the street and up and down the street. What are we doing to be allies with them? But what are they doing when we are in a time of need as well? I'm pleased that the our friends at Bethesda United have been very supportive and continue to send messages of support, which does not mean that every action of the Israeli government or of the American government is something that you get behind by saying that you stand with Israel or that you love Israel or that we are just supportive of each other as communities of faith. So it's unfortunate that TikTok and the newspapers are so myopic and so simplistic in how they present things. Because a response to the world can be fear. That here I just brought in chapter 8, just this repetition of, which we don't need to read the whole paragraph, but of fear and of help and of mercy and of fear. These are repeated words over and over again in the text for us to see. And I think it is for us to feel. And even older than the book of Esther, I brought a psalm that talks about being fearful of the world, of being in a place of darkness, of being in a place of difficulty. And I want us to know that we are not the first to go through this. We are not the first Jewish community to go through this. We are not the first time of our history to go through this. Often we think of this as a binary. It is a time of war or a time of peace. But Erica Brown, in something I was listening to this week, Dr. Erica Brown points to Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, to say that it is not either or. It is not a binary, it is cyclical, actually. And I thought that was a beautiful reading. So on page 3, a season is set for everything. I'm not going to sing the song for you, but we all know it. A time for every experience under heaven. A time for being born and a time for dying. A time for planting and a time for uprooting the planted. A time for slaying and a time for healing. A time for tearing down and a time for building. A time for weeping and a time for laughing. A time for wailing and a time for dancing. A time for throwing stones and a time for gathering stones. A time for embracing and a time for shunning embraces. A time for seeking and a time for losing, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for ripening and a time for sowing, a time for silence and a time for speaking, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for war and a time for peace. That this is not an either or. All of these are happening simultaneously. And of the emotions that are expressed here, I go through many each day. I feel like there is a time for weeping at moments and also a time for joy as well. And I feel like there is a time when I am when I am trying to manage anger that I'm feeling towards Hamas or whatever it might be, and also a time for loving as well. Whether loving Palestinians, loving Israelis, loving and expanding my heart, not contracting my heart. And there is a time for war, and there is a time for peace. That these are cyclical, and so maybe at the moment that we have now that is filled with fear and difficulty and uncertainty, we know that we will cycle out of this. That we know that the next chapter for our people will be positive, will be hopeful, will be flourishing, not just for us, but for others as well. That there will be a time of loving and a time of peace again. So in chapter 9 of Esther, consequently, these days are recalled and observed in every generation, by every family, every province, every city. And these days of Purim shall never cease amongst the Jews, and the memory of them shall never perish among the descendants. That we are told in chapter 9 that we have to remember that we are a resilient people. That there will be that time of fear. There will be that time of crisis that we do not know. what will be next for us. But we have to remember that we have overcome this. Together, we have overcome this by leaning on each other, and we have overcome this by having faith that we are in a cycle and having faith in things beyond us. Shabbat Shalom.